Hello students, today's agenda is to check homework. We'll be going over imaginary numbers and you will be able to do 1.5. Today students will be able to simplify expressions with imaginary or complex numbers, and you will be able to identify also the conjugate. Okay, so let me give you some information before we even start. So what is complex numbers? We saw already in the previous lesson natural, counting, whole numbers, integers, rational and irrational, and this is the next set of numbers. So mathematicians found out that you cannot take the square root of a negative number. And they say, oh, we cannot have something that doesn't have an answer, so they came up with what is, whenever you have the square root of a negative 1, the answer will be the I, which is imaginary number. And this is used mostly, in some of the areas that is used is in electricity, for sure. And so that helps them define what or decide which kind of voltage to use, I believe, for the cables that they use. So we also need to note that I square will be equal to -1. So I times I equals -1. Okay, so this is information that we will be using for the rest of this unit, so it's important that we have it in front of us. Okay, so let's start simplifying some square roots. And so we already know that the square root of 25 is one number multiplied times itself 2 times equals 25. Well, the answer is 5. Let me use a different color. Okay, square root of 81. Okay, 9 times 9 is 81, so the answer is 9. What is the square root of 1? 1 times 1 is 1, so the answer is 1. This is very important because once we go to the quadratic equations, a lot of people don't know that the square root of 1 can simplify to the whole number 1. Okay, so remember, square root of 1, the answer is 1. Now in here, this what is the square root of -81? Well, some people say -9. Well, what that means is that that number multiplied times itself 2 times equals -81, and so -9 times -9 gives me positive 81, not -81, so this does not work. So what this is in reality is -1 times positive 81, and we already know that the square root of 81 is 9. Okay, or well, actually this part, the answer is 9. But by definition of what we saw in here, square root of -1 is imaginary number. So this is imaginary number. So 9 times I is going to be 9I. Okay, so that's going to be the answer. What? Again, whenever we have a negative, we just separate it as -1 because negative times positive is negative. 1 times 81 is 81, so -81. We already know that the square root of -1 is I, and the square root of 81 is 9, so 9 times I is 9I. Okay, hopefully that's a little better. And so the same thing for this here. It's the same as -1 times 9. And so what is the square root of -1? Oh, the answer is I. What is the square root of 9? Oh, the answer is 3. And so 3 times I is 3I. 3 imaginary number. Okay? Or simply take the square root of 9. Square root of 9 is 3, and the negative becomes the I. Okay, only if it's inside of the square root. If you want to do it directly and kind of like not do that part. Okay, let's do some more, and these are gonna go hand in hand. So we know that the square root of 4 is 2. If we have a negative outside, be careful. A lot of people get confused and they want to put an I. No, that is a negative. It's outside. So you just carry it over. And then after that, square root of 4 is 2. So the negative of square root of 4 is just negative 2. In here, this is what becomes the I, and the square root of 4 becomes the 2. Okay? Or if you need to see it, is negative 1 times 4. The negative 1 becomes I. The square root of 4 becomes 2. Multiply 2 times I is 2I. Okay? So that's going to be my answer. 2I. If the negative is inside, that's when it becomes the imaginary number. Now, what happens if you have a negative outside and a negative inside? Well, the one outside, you just carry it over. The one inside becomes an I, and the square root of 4 is 2, and 2 times I is 2I. Okay? So be careful. Look at what you're doing, because you might get confused, and that's when we might start confusing them. Okay, sometimes outside you're going to have two different answers, and you will see why later on in quadratic equations. We end up with two answers actually, and so that's going to be carried over. The negative inside becomes the I because it's negative 1, and the square root of 4 is 2, so 2 times I is 2I. Okay, so again, just pay attention to where the negatives are, and if it's inside, it becomes the imaginary number. If it's outside, then you just carry it over to the answer. For the next part, and I hope I can get all of them here. Yay, I got it. Okay, for the next part, we have two different terms. These are called binomial. Bi because it's like a bicycle has two wheels, or bilingual, you have two languages. Okay, so binomial, it means it has two terms. Oh, and a monomial, a binomial. Okay, so I have different ones here. Okay, so in here it's asking us to identify the real portion of that binomial, the imaginary portion, and the conjugate. Okay, and the explanation in there says that the conjugate will always have the imaginary portion changed. We're going to change the sign. Okay, so we have to be careful with the imaginary portion. We need to change the sign. Okay, so what is the real portion of this? Is just the 2. What is the imaginary portion? Well, the part that has the imaginary number, so it's 3I. And what is the conjugate? You change the sign of the imaginary portion. So basically, if this is positive, then it's going to become negative. And we're going to be using that later on, so it is important that we understand this part. Okay, so you change that to 2 minus 3I. For the next one, the real portion is 5. The imaginary portion is negative 2I. And basically the conjugate is just keep this the same. This becomes plus 2I. For the next one is going to be the real portion is 1. The imaginary portion is negative I. And so it's going to be 1 plus I. For the conjugate, 1 plus I. Okay. The next part, the real portion is 5. The imaginary portion, we don't have any. And the conjugate is just 5. It stays the same. We didn't change anything because there's nothing to change for that part. For the next one, real portion, we don't have anything. The imaginary portion is the negative 4I, and the conjugate is going to be 4I. So you just change the sign of that part. The real portion, carefully here, notice how they are switched, so it's going to be 3. The imaginary portion is 2i. And so you're going to have negative 2i plus 3. I noticed that in previous classes, what they switched is this part, just because they're switched. So be careful. What we're switching or changing the sign is the imaginary portion. Okay? So with that, you are now able to do 1.5 and have fun.